Have you ever imagined being taken to heaven in a chariot of fire? Well, the story of Elijah is sure to surprise you. Think of a brave prophet who stood up against falsehood and idolatry, challenging everything and everyone to defend God's truth. And instead of dying like any ordinary person, Elijah had a glorious end, being taken to heaven in a heavenly chariot pulled by fiery horses. This epic moment reveals God's power in a way we've never seen before. And here's the big mystery. What does Elijah's ascension teach us about what God is still doing in our lives today? Get ready for an extraordinary journey where we'll not only explore divine power, but also discover how this ancient story carries a powerful and relevant message for today. Elijah wasn't just a prophet. He was a messenger of change, hope, and unwavering faith. So what can we learn from that? Throughout this journey, you'll see that what happened to Elijah reflects a much bigger plan of God's, one that He has for each of us too. Want to know how this connects to your life? Then stay with us until the end and see how this story ties into your life. The kingdom of Israel under the reign of Ahab and Jezebel went through a drastic transformation. During this time, the people strayed away from the true God, being seduced by a form of worship that seemed more modern, appealing, and in many cases more convenient. Baal, the god of fertility and weather, captured Israel's heart with promises of prosperity and good harvests. But what appeared to be an innocent worship on the surface led the Israelites to forget the one true God. This story might sound familiar today, doesn't it? How many times do we allow ourselves to be seduced by shortcuts and easy solutions, forgetting the principles that truly sustain our lives? For Israel, worshipping Baal wasn't just a religious choice. It was an attitude of discommitment from what truly mattered. They were looking outside of God for what they thought would solve their problems. And this happens all the time. We seek quick alternatives for emotional, financial, or spiritual dilemmas rather than trusting and waiting for divine wisdom. But what was the impact of worshipping Baal? Israel's society began to slowly crumble as their spiritual and moral foundations were eroded. It's not hard to see the similarities with our own wrong choices. When we stray from solid and true principles, whether in our personal lives, work, or faith, what once seemed good can lead us to ruin. Israel was experiencing a quiet decay, drifting further away from the God who had freed them from slavery in Egypt. It's important to note that this worship didn't happen in isolation. There was constant pressure for the Israelites to conform and worship Baal, just like everyone around them. Social pressure is one of the greatest temptations we face. Many times we are challenged to follow the crowd, even if it means abandoning our deepest values or beliefs. But this is exactly where the conscious choice must be made, to be like Israel and give in to the pressure, or to stand firm in our faith, even if it seems like we're alone. In times of affliction, like in Israel's case, many turn to the worship of something or someone that promises immediate relief. Baal represented this promise, material prosperity and instant happiness. But in reality, this solution was nothing but an illusion. Those who gave in to this worship ended up drifting away from the true source of life and peace. The big question is, what has been the Baal in our lives? What has been leading us away from the true purpose? Still, even in the face of so many temptations and external influences, a spark of hope still burned in the hearts of some. The people of Israel still had the chance to turn back to the true God and renew their covenant. The question is, how many would be willing to leave behind what seemed comfortable and true to embrace what, though difficult, was eternal? What can we learn from this? Every day we need to make conscious choices. Worshipping Baal in Israel wasn't just about following a pagan god. It was about a lack of commitment to the God who had chosen them. And as we reflect on our own lives, are we committed to what is eternal, or are we seeking temporary and easy solutions? This journey of straying and returning paves the way for the calling of a prophet who would rise up to confront the worship of Baal and restore the true worship of God in Israel. Let's then explore the story of Elijah, who with courage and determination stood up against false worship and brought about a spiritual awakening to the people of Israel. Elijah wasn't just a prophet. He was a messenger during a time of great apostasy and corruption. When Ahab and Jezebel's reign took hold, spiritual chaos overtook Israel. The people had strayed, and much of the nation was immersed in the worship of Baal. It was in this dark scenario that God called Elijah to rise up, not just as a preacher, but as someone willing to challenge the established order. He knew his mission would be difficult, but he was also fully aware that his task was crucial to restore the truth. That was a time when true faith was on the brink of extinction, and the difficulties Elijah faced were immense. Imagine being the only person who opposes an entire culture, where everyone around you seems to blindly follow the wrong path. Like Elijah, many times in life, we are called to swim against the current, to be the voice crying out in the wilderness. Elijah's example teaches us that being faithful is not easy, but it is absolutely necessary. He knew that his commitment to God meant standing up against the established powers, no matter the cost. Elijah, being the only prophet of God in a land lost in deception, faced a complex dilemma. He knew Israel was spiritually lost, but he also knew that without a direct confrontation, they would never understand the seriousness of the situation. In this scenario, God raised him up as an example of courage and obedience, even in the face of forces much greater than himself. Sometimes, when facing great difficulties, we need an Elijah on our journey, someone with the courage to challenge us, to take us out of our comfort zone, and show us a different path. In the modern world, where external pressures to follow spiritual or ideological trends are becoming stronger, Elijah's example resonates in a powerful way. He didn't hesitate to oppose the majority, and he did it with the strength of his conviction. Today, when everything around you seems to demand that you conform to standards that don't align with your values, Elijah's story becomes a powerful source of inspiration. He teaches us that our mission, though challenging, has a greater purpose, and that faithfulness to God is more important than any approval we might seek from others. Elijah's calling wasn't just a call for external action, but also for internal transformation. For God to use him, Elijah had to be willing to face a difficult and solitary journey. And here, there's a crucial lesson for all of us. Sometimes the greatest challenge isn't what is asked of us externally, but what is required of us internally. Like Elijah, we may be called to change, to overcome our own fears and limitations. The prophet Elijah, then, wasn't a fictional hero, but a real person with a divine mission in times of crisis. His story reminds us that, in times of great spiritual need, the courage to follow the truth and the strength to challenge norms can arise from unexpected sources. When this happens, a spark of renewal begins to ignite. Elijah not only confronted Jezebel and Ahab, but also inspired generations of faithful people to follow the true God, even in the most difficult circumstances. What stands out most in Elijah's story is his willingness to be the agent of change, even when change seemed impossible. This willingness makes us reflect on our own lives. Are we ready to be used by God, even when that means going against the tide, even when all eyes are on us? This courage especially shows up when we see the harsh reality of idolatry in Israel and the urgent need to restore true worship. The spirit of Elijah ignites within us when we decide in the midst of difficult times to be the prophets of change. Those who, like Elijah, have the audacity to preach the truth, to challenge the lies around us, and to restore what has been lost. But as we'll see, this challenge wouldn't be easy, and Elijah's mission was just beginning. The drought that Elijah prophesied wasn't just a simple weather forecast. It was a divine act, a direct judgment from God against the idolatry that had spread throughout Israel. Elijah, obedient to God's voice, boldly declared that there would be no rain or dew until he, by God's command, said otherwise. This act of judgment was severe, but also full of mercy. The drought's purpose was to bring the people back to the reality of their choices, reminding them that worshipping Baal would not bring the prosperity they so desired. Imagine living in a land where rain is essential for life, for the harvest, for survival. Without it, the nation begins to fall apart. That's exactly what happened to Israel. The drought was a reflection of the spiritual drought the people were experiencing. When we stray from the true source, life begins to dry up. This episode challenges us to reflect on our own lives. What is dry inside of us? What areas of our life are experiencing scarcity because we've strayed from the divine source? Practically speaking, what can we learn from this story? Elijah's drought wasn't just about a lack of rain, but about a lack of true spirituality in the hearts of Israel. Similarly, in our lives, sometimes we go through spiritual droughts. These scarcity periods can be signs that something is missing in our relationship with God. When we feel like things are stagnant and emotional, financial, or spiritual prosperity isn't flowing like it used to, it's time to reflect on our connection with the source of life. However, the drought also brought with it an opportunity for repentance and return. Elijah wasn't just there to point the finger, but to offer a chance for reconciliation. In our lives, the difficulties we face, no matter how harsh, often become opportunities to return to where we need to be, in God's presence. This is the moment to look inward and ask, am I truly seeking the real source, or am I feeding on temporary, empty substitutes? Elijah's decision to prophesy the drought was a demonstration of his unwavering trust in God. He knew that by speaking the truth, many might not understand, but he also knew that in the long run, this would be the only way to restore the nation. Elijah's obedience, even without a guarantee of immediate results, teaches us that true trust in God doesn't depend on visible outcomes in the moment, but on the certainty that we are fulfilling His will. It's interesting to note that the drought, while a judgment from God, also served as a purification mechanism. The scarcity forced the people to reevaluate their beliefs and turn their hearts back to the one true God. This reminds us that many times, moments of difficulty aren't punishments, but opportunities for growth and transformation. What seems like an obstacle can, in fact, be a springboard to a deeper level of faith and commitment to God. When the drought occurred, many might have lost hope. But as we'll see next, God had a plan to take care of Elijah during this time, showing that even in the driest seasons of life, divine provision never fails. Elijah's story doesn't end with the drought, but with the experience of how God cares for His servants, even in times of crisis. God's judgment, though harsh, was intertwined with His fatherly care. Thus, the episode of the drought paves the way for a unique experience of divine providence, one that would test not only Elijah's patience but also the faith of the people. It is in this time of scarcity that Elijah would be unexpectedly sustained, leading us to a new stage of our journey. In the midst of the drought that was devastating Israel, God demonstrated His providence in a surprising and powerful way. He sent ravens to feed Elijah. Imagine the scene. In a barren landscape where food was scarce and needs were many, God orchestrated a miraculous provision. Ravens, common birds often associated with indifference, became messengers of divine provision. This teaches us that even in the hardest moments, when it seems like help won't come, God has unexpected ways of taking care of us. This story is a powerful lesson in faith. Elijah didn't know how he would be fed during the drought, but he trusted in God's promise. He didn't question the process. He simply accepted that God would do the impossible. Likewise, in our lives, we often face difficult situations and see no solution in sight. Yet trust in God allows us to wait for the unexpected. When we are in total dependence on God, He can use sources we would never imagine to sustain us. How many times in our own journey have we gone through financial, emotional, or spiritual droughts and felt abandoned? Elijah's example shows us that even when help seems unlikely, God can use any means, even ravens. On a practical level, this makes us reflect. Are we leaving room for God to act in surprising ways in our lives? Or are we so focused on our own solutions that we ignore the creative and unexpected ways God can bless us? What's even more fascinating about this story is that the ravens didn't just bring food, they did so consistently. God didn't just provide one meal, but took care of Elijah day after day. This reflects God's ongoing care for us. It's not something occasional, but daily provision, like the manna sent to the people of Israel in the desert. In our lives, we can see this in the small daily blessings that we often fail to recognize, whether in our work, friendships, or the opportunities that come in unexpected ways. The story of Elijah and the ravens also reminds us of God's faithfulness. Even when the world around us seems to be in ruins and life feels difficult, He never fails to sustain us. Elijah, in his simplicity, completely trusted in what God had said, and God fulfilled His promise. This challenges us to trust in God not only in times of abundance, but also in times of scarcity. True faith is the kind that doesn't waver, even when the winds of difficulty are strong. It's worth noting that despite being fed by the ravens, Elijah wasn't living in abundance. He was living in faithfulness. He was in a period of drought and difficulty, but that didn't mean God had forgotten him. How many of us, in times of difficulty, feel that God is distant? Yet Elijah's story shows us that even in the most adverse circumstances, God is working behind the scenes to provide everything we need until abundance is restored. God's providence, seen through the feeding of the ravens, also teaches us about the importance of trust. Elijah didn't question how the ravens would bring the food, nor whether the food would be enough. He simply trusted. And in the end, that's what is asked of us. An unshakable trust that allows God to act in our lives, even when traditional solutions seem impossible. This episode paves the way for something even greater in Elijah's journey. After being sustained in such an extraordinary way, Elijah will have an encounter with a widow, where faith and divine provision will be tested even more. But for now, the lesson is clear. God is faithful in his provision, even when we don't see the way ahead. The story of the widow of Zarephath is a touching example of how God uses desperate situations to demonstrate his grace and provision. When Elijah arrived in Zarephath, he found a widow on the verge of dying from hunger. She had only a handful of flour and a little oil, and planned to prepare her last meal for herself and her son. She was undoubtedly in a desperate situation, but it was precisely in this moment that she received a divine visit that would transform her life forever. God instructed Elijah to ask the widow to give him food first, before preparing a meal for herself and her son. At first glance, this request may seem cruel. How could a woman in her extreme need give the little she had to someone else? However, this was her opportunity to show faith and trust in the Lord. By obeying, she not only fed the prophet, but also became part of a miracle that would provide enough food for her to survive through the entire drought. This simple yet powerful action teaches us that faith can open the door to divine provision. When we find ourselves in times of scarcity, like the widow, we are often tempted to hold on to everything we have for ourselves. The fear of not having enough keeps us from being generous, even when it seems we have nothing to offer. Yet, what this story teaches us is that, by demonstrating faith and generosity, even in the smallest things, God can multiply what we have in ways we can't foresee. The widow didn't know how her oil and flour would be multiplied, but she trusted, and that trust resulted in a miracle. In today's world, where concern about scarcity is a reality for many, the story of the widow of Zarephath challenges us to think differently. Generosity should not be measured by the quantity of what we have, but by the willingness of our heart. Often, our limited vision keeps us from seeing the potential that lies in our hands. When we give, whether it's time, resources, or love, God is able to multiply it supernaturally, far beyond what we could imagine. Practically, how can we apply this story in our lives? Perhaps you find yourself in a time of financial or emotional difficulty and think that you don't have enough to help others or even yourself. But like the widow, you have something to offer. Maybe it's not money, but your time, your energy, or your prayers. Small acts of generosity can have a transformative impact. By showing trust in God and his ability to provide, you create space for miracles to happen in your life. This story also reveals the power of obedience. The widow didn't question Elijah's request. She simply did what she was instructed to do, even when it seemed irrational. Obedience to God often leads us to do things we don't fully understand, but that are essential for our journey. Sometimes, we need to take a step of faith even when we don't know what the next step will look like. Obedience in difficult times is a reflection of unwavering trust in God. Additionally, this miracle reminds us that when God calls us to something, he also prepares the means to fulfill his will. The widow didn't have to worry about the details. She trusted and acted, and God provided everything she needed. This teaches us that, in our walk of faith, we should trust that when God calls us, he already has everything planned. We don't need to try to solve everything on our own. Our part is to trust, obey, and do what is within our reach. The miracle that took place in Zarephath wasn't just for the widow, but for everyone around her. Her faith and obedience directly impacted her life and her sons. This miracle challenges us to think about how our faith can impact those around us. Sometimes our obedience to God doesn't just transform our own lives, but also creates a domino effect of blessings for those we interact with. Now, with the miracle in Zarephath, Elijah's story takes on new life. God not only provided for the prophet in his personal drought, but also used the widow to show that he can provide in unexpected ways. But as we will see next, this miracle will be just a glimpse of God's power over life and death, as Elijah witnesses another, even more extraordinary miracle, the resurrection of the widow's son. After the miracle of provision in the widow's house, something even more extraordinary happened. The widow's son became severely ill and eventually died. Desperate, the widow took her son's body to Elijah, asking, "What have you done to me, man of God?" She was deeply sorrowful, believing that the death of her son was a punishment for her sins. This situation of extreme pain and hopelessness led Elijah to fervently pray to God, asking for the boy's life. What followed was one of the most emotional and impactful moments of Elijah's life, the resurrection of the widow's son. This miracle was not just an act of power, but also of compassion. Elijah, moved by the widow's pain, interceded on behalf of the boy. He didn't just ask God for the boy's life, but laid himself over the boy's body, praying intensely like an intercessor. This act of faith and prayer reminds us of the power prayer has to change seemingly hopeless situations. Elijah did not accept death as the final word. He believed that God could bring life where it seemed there was none. In many moments of our lives, we find ourselves in situations that seem to have no way out. It could be the loss of a loved one, a failed project, or even a broken relationship. In these moments, death seems to be the only reality we can see. But the story of Elijah and the resurrection of the widow's son teaches us that even in the most desperate situations, God has the power to bring life back. Death, in the spiritual and emotional sense, is never the end when God is present. Moreover, this miracle of resurrection is a testimony to God's power over death. Elijah's faith and his willingness to act in God's name brought about a restoration that not only brought the widow's son back to life, but also restored hope in the heart of a mother. The resurrection of the son brought not only life to the body, but also hope to the widow's spirit, who had lost everything. This story reminds us that resurrection is not just a physical event, but a renewal of spirit and soul. When everything seems lost, God is able to bring renewal and restore what has been broken. When we face pain and suffering, we often think we are alone. The widow, in her anguish, believed that God had abandoned her, but God was much closer than she imagined. He used the prophet Elijah to restore what seemed lost. Similarly, in our difficulties, we need to remember that even when we can't see it, God is working behind the scenes to bring healing and restoration. This miracle also challenges us to think about the power of intercession. Elijah interceded for the widow and her son, even without knowing if he would be heard. He was bold in his prayer, and God responded powerfully. In our lives, we are often called to intercede for those around us. Intercessory prayer is an act of faith and love, where we place ourselves between God and the person in need, believing that God can perform miracles. Just like Elijah, we can be instruments of restoration and hope in the lives of others. Furthermore, the miracle of the widow's son teaches us that God is a God of details. He didn't just respond to Elijah's request, but he brought the boy's life back in an extraordinary way. God doesn't do things halfway. He cares about every detail of our lives, and when he acts perfectly. This is a powerful reminder. In our prayers, we should trust that God hears every word and responds according to his divine wisdom. Elijah's act not only demonstrated God's power over death, but also taught the widow and all those around her that even in the darkest moments, God's light can shine. The resurrection was not just proof that God is sovereign, but also a lesson on the importance of trusting in divine providence, even when everything seems lost. The widow's son was restored to life, and his mother received back her hope, her joy, and most importantly, her faith. This miracle sets the stage for Elijah's great confrontation with the prophets of Baal, where he would once again demonstrate God's power over the forces of darkness. But before this epic battle took place, the resurrection reminds us that In our faith journey, true strength lies not just in external confrontations, but in our continued trust in a God who is capable of restoring life in any situation. Mount Carmel became the stage for one of the most dramatic and iconic confrontations in biblical history. It was here that Elijah challenged the 450 prophets of Baal to a public showdown, a test of faith that would reveal which God was truly the Lord. The proposal was simple. Both groups would prepare an altar, place a sacrifice on it, and cry out for fire from heaven. The God who responded with fire would be recognized as the one true God. This wasn't just a challenge against the prophets of Baal, it was a battle for the soul of Israel, which had become deeply involved in the worship of the pagan god. Imagine the tension in the air. On one side, Elijah, the lone prophet of God, facing a crowd. On the other, the prophets of Baal backed by Jezebel and Ahab. This confrontation wasn't just about power, it was about identity and loyalty. The people of Israel needed to make a decision. How many times in our own lives are we also challenged to choose between what is true and what seems more attractive or easier? Like the people of Israel, we often waver between two paths, the path of truth or the path of convenience. The prophets of Baal cried out, danced, and even cut themselves to try to get their God to send fire. But nothing happened. Frustration was evident. This episode serves as a powerful reminder that often we seek answers in unreliable sources. The solutions the world offers for our problems may seem attractive, but in the end, they lack the power to transform or save us. Like the prophets of Baal, we often find ourselves trying something that doesn't work because we're depending on something that has no power to help us. When it was Elijah's turn, he did something that, at first glance, seemed somewhat unusual. He asked for the altar to be covered with water. In a time of drought, when water was a scarce resource, this was an audacious act of faith. Elijah knew that true faith isn't based on visible circumstances, but on the power of God. Just like Elijah in our lives, we need to act with faith even when everything around us says the opposite. Acting with faith may mean making bold decisions that defy logic, but, in the end, reveal God's power in our lives. Elijah prayed simply and directly, asking God to send fire. And suddenly God's fire descended from heaven, consuming the sacrifice, the wood, the stones, and even the water around the altar. God's response was swift and powerful, and the people's reaction was immediate. The Lord, He is God. The Lord, He is God. This scene is a powerful reminder that when we seek divine intervention with a sincere heart, God does not hesitate to act in marvelous ways. He has the power to make the impossible happen, and His power is infinitely greater than any other god or influence we may try to invoke. After the confrontation, Elijah ordered the prophets of Baal to be captured and destroyed, symbolizing the triumph of truth over lies and the defeat of idolatry. This event wasn't just about showing God's power. It was also about restoring spiritual order in Israel. Likewise, in our lives, we must be willing to confront the idolatries that pull us away from true worship. Whether it's the love of money, status, or power, these false worships often become idols that distract us from God. Elijah's confrontation is a call for us to repent from these false worships and return to the true God. The great lesson of Mount Carmel is that, despite the apparent temporary victories of Baal and other gods, truth will always prevail. In the end, true worship of God is the only worship that has the power to transform lives. And this worship is not about empty words or ceremonies, but about genuine faith and action. Like Elijah, we must be willing to be the loners in a world that often seeks easy but empty solutions. True faith is the kind that stands firm, even when the world around us is heading down the wrong path. After this victory, Israel's faith was renewed, and the people began to cry out to the Lord again. But what followed was the restoration of God's blessing, symbolized by the coming of rain. This moment of confrontation on Mount Carmel sets the stage for Israel's spiritual restoration, which will be the next step in this journey of faith and renewal. After Elijah's triumph over the prophets of Baal, the time came for the fulfillment of God's promise, the rain. The drought that had tormented Israel for so long was about to end. Elijah, his spirit renewed by the victory over the false gods, climbed Mount Carmel, and before God, began to pray for the rain that would bring restoration to the thirsty land. 7 times, Elijah sent his servant to look toward the horizon, until finally he saw a small cloud like the hand of a man approaching. It was God's promise being fulfilled. This moment of rain was not just a relief for the people, but also a profound symbol of spiritual restoration. During the drought, the people had experienced hunger, scarcity, and suffering. But with the arrival of the rain, it wasn't just the land that would be restored, but their dry hearts as well. God was sending not only water to the earth, but a clear sign that when the people turn back to Him, divine blessing begins to flow again. The rain then became a symbol of renewal, both for nature and for the human spirit. In many areas of our lives, we face spiritual droughts. It may be a season where we feel like nothing is growing, our prayers aren't being answered, or we're stuck in a cycle of difficulties. But the rain that Elijah prayed for, the rain that was poured out on Israel, teaches us that when true worship is restored, blessings begin to flow again. What can we learn here? Even in the driest moments of our lives, we need to remember that God can bring renewal and restoration in ways we never imagined. Sometimes the rain of blessings comes gradually, like a small cloud on the horizon, but when it arrives, it brings abundant life. The rain, in this context, represents more than just a physical need. It symbolizes God's grace and mercy. He knew that the people of Israel needed not only food, but also an inner transformation. When we find ourselves in times of spiritual drought, our prayer should be for this kind of rain, not just for immediate needs, but for the complete restoration of our souls. The rain that Elijah asked for wasn't just to resolve the immediate problem of hunger. It was to restore the relationship between the people and the God who had created them. God has mysterious ways of restoring what was lost. The small cloud that appeared on the horizon was a clear sign that God's intervention was about to take place. Often in our own lives, divine solutions begin in small, almost imperceptible ways. We might not see big changes immediately, but just like the cloud Elijah saw, God is always in control, orchestrating what's to come. What seems like a simple sign could be the precursor to a great blessing, like the rain that would bring prosperity back to Israel. Furthermore, the rain represents God's faithfulness in fulfilling His promises. He had promised to restore the land, and now He was fulfilling that promise. In times of difficulty, we may wonder if God will fulfill His promises in our lives. But Elijah's story reminds us that even in times of drought, God's word remains faithful. His promises never fail. The rain that fell on Israel is a reflection of God's faithfulness, who always fulfills what He says. This act of restoration also challenges us to reflect on the role of faith in the process of renewal. Elijah prayed persistently, believing the rain would come, and when the small cloud finally appeared, he was sure the great blessing was on its way. Similarly, in our lives, faith must be persistent. Sometimes we need to pray and wait patiently, even when the answers seem distant. Persistent faith, like Elijah's prayer, is what allows God's blessings to manifest. When the rain finally came, it wasn't just a blessing for the land, but also a reaffirmation of Elijah's authority as God's prophet. The people, who had been spiritually restored, now saw the visible proof that the Lord was with Elijah. As the rain fell, the people once again recognized God's truth. This moment of restoration marked the end of the drought and the return of God's favor. However, for the blessing to continue, more than just the rain would be needed. A continued heart of worship and faithfulness to God would be necessary. And, as we'll see next, Elijah would face new challenges that would test his faith in even more intense ways. After the great victory over the prophets of Baal and the restoration of God's blessing, Elijah still found himself fleeing into the desert. Jezebel, furious over the death of her prophets, swore revenge against God's prophet. Alone and exhausted, Elijah took refuge in the desert, feeling completely defeated. He asked God to take his life, feeling isolated and powerless to continue. This scene of such a great and courageous prophet being consumed by loneliness and fear teaches us that even the greatest men of faith face moments of weakness. Elijah wasn't just fleeing from a physical threat, but from a deep emotional state. Loneliness is an experience that we all face at some point. If you've ever felt alone in your struggles with no support or no direction, you can understand a bit of what Elijah was going through. The desert in this context is more than a physical place. It represents those times when we feel distant from God, from others, and even from ourselves. But as we see in Elijah's story, the desert is also the place where God can meet us in profound and transformative ways. In the midst of his loneliness, Elijah received divine nourishment and care. An angel appeared and fed him with bread and water, not once but twice. This act of care not only provided for Elijah's physical needs, but also gave him the strength to continue his journey. When we are in our own moments of solitude, what we often need most isn't just an external solution, but a touch of care and love that restores us from within. God, as he did with Elijah, comes to us in our darkest moments and strengthens us with his blessings. This episode also teaches us the importance of hearing God's voice, even in times of silence. After being fed, Elijah went to Mount Horeb, where he had a personal encounter with God. On the mountain, Elijah received an important revelation. God wasn't in the storm, the fire, or the earthquake, but in the gentle whisper. This moment is revealing. Often, we seek God's answers in moments of great turmoil or dramatic events, but he reveals himself in moments of quiet and peace. In silence, we find God's voice clearer and more present. Elijah's desert was also a place of restoration, where he had to reconnect with God, seek direction and renewal. Like Elijah, in times of difficulty and loneliness, we need to stop and listen to God's voice. In the chaos of life, we can become so caught up in our problems and the noise around us that we can't hear his guidance. However, it is in stillness, in quiet prayer, that we often find the clarity we need to move forward. Another important lesson from this story is the understanding that loneliness is not a sign of God abandoning us. Elijah might have thought that God had forgotten him, but God was with him, caring for him and preparing him for what was to come. Often, in our own loneliness, we question where God is, but the truth is he never abandons us. He is with us, even in the moments when we cannot perceive his presence. After the desert, Elijah rose up renewed, ready to fulfill the next step of his mission. The experience in the desert not only prepared him for what lay ahead, but also strengthened his faith. This passage reminds us that the desert is not the end of the journey, but a point of transition, where God shapes and prepares us for something greater. Elijah's challenge was to overcome his loneliness and find strength in God to move forward. As we reflect on Elijah's desert experience, we are invited to look at our own lives. When we find ourselves going through the desert, what can we do? We need to remember that, just like Elijah, God is with us, feeding us, strengthening us, and preparing us for what lies ahead. The desert is just a part of the journey, and when we come out of it, we come out stronger, more aware, and more ready for the mission God has for us. Elijah's journey reached its climax when he was taken to heaven in a chariot of fire. After fulfilling the mission God had entrusted to him, Elijah knew his time on earth was coming to an end. However, the way God chose to take him from this life was extraordinary. Alongside his disciple Elisha, Elijah was taken to heaven without experiencing death, in a chariot of fire drawn by fiery horses, in a vision no one would ever forget. This event not only marked the end of Elijah's life, but also symbolized God's power over life and death, and the calling of a new prophet to continue the work of restoration. Elijah's ascension was not just a physical transition, but a powerful statement that when we fulfill our purpose with faithfulness, God honors us in ways beyond what we can imagine. Elijah didn't die like many others. He was taken directly into the presence of God. This challenges us to reflect on our own life purpose. Are we fulfilling the mission God has for us with faithfulness and obedience? If so, as Elijah's story shows, the reward won't only be at the end of the journey, but in honorable ways that transcend earthly life. The chariot of fire, with its fiery horses, was not a mere mode of transportation. It was a manifestation of God's power and glory. This moment serves as a reminder that God doesn't call us to just any life, but to a life filled with purpose, miracles, and glory. Elijah wasn't taken in a common manner. He was transported in a glorious vehicle, as a demonstration that when we surrender to God, He also honors us in extraordinary ways. In our own lives, when we fulfill God's calling, He can surprise us in ways we never imagined. Elijah's ascension also brought a lesson of continuity. Elisha, his disciple, witnessed this grand event and received the responsibility of continuing the work that Elijah had started. The passing of the mantle between Elijah and Elisha teaches us the importance of raising up new leaders and passing on wisdom. Even though the leader may be gone, God's mission does not end. In our own contexts, we must understand that our journey is not just about what we do for ourselves, but about the legacy we leave for future generations. Elijah wasn't taken to heaven to live forever. He was taken to ensure that God's mission would continue under Elisha's leadership. Elijah's ascension also reflects God's eternal purpose. By taking him directly to heaven, God made it clear that Elijah's work was completed according to His perfect plan. Often in our own lives, we go through situations where we feel like our journey has ended or that our efforts haven't mattered. But like Elijah, when we faithfully fulfill what God asks of us, He honors us in ways that exceed our expectations. Elijah's life teaches us that the end of a journey can be more glorious than any earthly success we could imagine. Moreover, the fact that Elijah did not experience physical death shows us the possibility of life beyond death, a more glorious existence than we can understand. Elijah's ascension foreshadows something all believers look forward to, the promise of eternal life, where, at the end of our journeys, we will be received into God's presence, just as Elijah was. This prompts us to reflect on our own hope in God and what we are waiting for beyond this life. Elijah's ascension is, in many ways, a preview of what awaits us as children of God. Elijah, being taken to heaven, also reminds us that, regardless of the difficulties and struggles we face, our ultimate destiny is in God's hands. Our story doesn't end with the hardships of earthly life, but in the glorious presence of God. Like Elijah, we are called to persevere to the end with unwavering faith, knowing that at the end of the journey, we will receive a greater reward than anything we can achieve in this life. Elijah's legacy is not only that of a powerful prophet, but of a man who faithfully fulfilled his mission and saw the reward of obedience in eternal life. Elijah's ascension marks the end of one era, but also opens the way for a new beginning with Elisha. This moment prepares us for the next steps in Israel's history, where God would continue to reveal Himself and act powerfully through His prophets. Elijah's mission may have come to an end, but God's mission does not stop. And like Elijah, we are called to continue God's work, knowing that our life, when dedicated to Him, is never in vain. So what did you think of Elijah's story? His courage, faith, and trust in God are powerful examples we can apply to our own journey, no matter what challenges we face. Elijah didn't settle for the difficulties. He rose up in faith, even when it seemed like he was all alone in the world. He confronted evil head-on and trusted in God's power to act in ways no one could imagine. His story reminds us that with God by our side, even the toughest moments can be overcome in a glorious way, and our mission goes far beyond the adversities we face. Elijah's life teaches us that, like him, we can be messengers of truth and change in a world that often prefers the ease of lies. He didn't bow to societal or political pressures, and his determination to follow God's will was rewarded with the honor of being taken to heaven in a unique way. What can we learn from this? In our lives, when we remain faithful, even in the face of the greatest opposition, God honors our faith and uses us in extraordinary ways. Now it's your turn to take action. What will you do with the strength and example of Elijah? Are you ready to face life's deserts with courage? How about setting aside fear and acting in faith, knowing that, just like Elijah, you are never alone? If this story inspired you, don't forget to subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications to keep following more powerful stories like this. Together, let's learn and grow, getting closer to the God who cares for us in every moment and calls us to be a light in a world that needs His truth.